Okay, a few remaining things on the startup template. Since Game of Life is actually going to be animated, it's going to be running at a certain number of frames per second, we need something to control that. And as we've previously seen, what I've added up here to the form class is this object called a timer. Now, a timer is a Windows object. It can be set up and set to a certain interval. And basically what it does is it calls an event known as the tick event every so many milliseconds. By default, I've constructed it here, but I've actually set it up down in the constructor. I'm setting the interval to 100. That's 100 milliseconds, meaning that 10 times a second this will get called. I'm mapping the timer's tick event to this method right here. Okay, this is the tick event, and what it's going to do is call next generation. Now, I recommend in some of the documentation for Game of Life on how to get started setting it up that most of the work of calculating the next generation be placed in a method called next generation. Okay, so this is where most of your work is going to be. This is where you're going to iterate through the current universe, count the neighbors, get the neighbor count for each cell, apply the rules of Game of Life, and then turn the cells on and off in a second array. And when you're done, you're basically going to swap those two arrays, and most of that work is going to be done here. So currently this is being called by next generation. Now, I have the timer running automatically, so when we start the application up, we see down here in the status strip that it's counting up. Now, the status strip is another strip, and down here I added to the status strip something called a status label, and this is called, I renamed it from toolstrip status label 1 to toolstrip status label generations, and it's basically by setting its text property that I can write stuff to it. And so over here in my code, each time timer tick gets called, it calls next generation, and then generation increments generations. That's the integer that I created here. And then with this line of code, it basically writes a new string out to that status strip object, indicating the number of generations that have passed through the program. Now, basically you can stop or start the timer in two different ways. It has an enabled property. If I come in here and set the enabled property to false, then the timer will not be running by default when I start it up, and we'll see generations is always set to 0. Another way you can start and stop the timer is it also has a method called start that will just start it running, and it has a method called stop that will stop it running. So either one of those can be used as well as enabled. They basically do exactly the same thing. Okay, so in Game of Life, right, the demo for Game of Life, basically we add some patterns, okay, and central to the Game of Life is to start, pause, and advance one generation at a time. This can be done through tool strip items, but it should also be able to be done through menu items, and basically this is the heart of the game. Now, the way I implement it, start and pause are doing nothing more than coming in and starting the timer. Okay, so about the only code inside this click event for the start is start the timer, set it's enabled to true, start it running, it calls next generation, starts updating the generations. When I click pause or stop, all it does is stop the timer from running. Now, when I click next, all I do is just call next generation directly without worrying about calling it from the timer tick event. And one of the things we'll be able to do is change the timing, how many frames a second, okay, that it actually renders the game, and that can be changed by updating the timer's interval property. This is just an integer. Again, it's in milliseconds. 1,000 milliseconds will, of course, be a second. If you set the interval much to really below 20, you really won't notice much of a change. The timer tick event is an event. It has to go through the message loop in Windows, so there's a little bit of time involved in that. But from 20 on up, you should start to notice a difference when you're running the timer. So at the heart of our game is going to be manipulating this timer, stopping and starting it to get Game of Life to run and Game of Life to pause. And next generation is where you should put most of your basic code to get started. That's where you'll want to, again, calculate the next generation of the game. And the timer is just going to repeatedly call it over and over again, which is going to animate our game. Thanks.